lives were changed forever by AIDS. Together we will consider the ways that the AIDS epidemic shaped and continued to shape our analysis of how race, class, gender, and religion form and deform our lives and the social fabric. We will consider how our feelings and experiences of AIDS help us to discern what is going on now and how to move forward in our spiritual lives and our activism. What did AIDS teach us about how to do an analysis of current events and how to shape our lives and activism today? How does AIDS put us in the heart of intersectionality? We appreciate that you've given up time in the course of this conference to be here. We know that it was essentially, initially, a conference about LGBTQ issues, homosexuality and religion, a history conference, and yet I'm sure none of us, for all of us, HIV/AIDS is an interrelated topic as we look at this past 15-year period. So we wanted to be sure that it was included, and for those of us who are the panelists, it certainly was part of our AIDS experience. And we also know that there is significant experience represented in the room, and that's why this is called a conversation. So we are part of a planned conversation. We ultimately, of course, want to involve you in this piece as well. So we have some prepared questions that we'll respond to, and then we want to involve you in it. And for us, it is about our pasts, as you'll hear, but it is also very much about the present. And we have a couple of ways to make that point clear. First, our group chant. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. But wait, there's more. Act up, fight back, end AIDS.
Act up, fight back, end AIDS. Act up, fight back, end AIDS.
So a little past, a little present. And then perhaps you saw in the news in the last just couple of weeks something that brought a number of us back 30 years to what brought us back to the 30 years was if you were working in AIDS politics in the 1980s, you might recall in California there was a state ballot proposition called Proposition 64 that was sponsored by a politician named Lyndon LaRouche.
You know, I'm afraid we're going to lose this if we don't.
All right.
You know, because I keep losing.
Which was about quarantining people with HIV. So 2 weeks ago, that failed. None of us worked on that. 2 weeks ago, Betty Price, state legislator from Georgia, had this to share.
This is Betty Price.
Surveillance of partners, tracking of contacts, that sort of thing. What are we legally able to do? And I don't want to say the quarantine word, but I guess I just said it. I mean, is there an ability, since I would guess that public dollars are expended heavily in prophylaxis and treatment of this condition, so we have a public interest in curtailing the spread. What would you advise, or are there any methods legally that we could do that would curtail the spread? It seems to me it's almost frightening the number of people living that are potentially carriers, and well, they're carriers, but potential to spread. Whereas in the past, they died more readily, and then at that point they were posing a risk. So we've got a huge population posing a risk if they're not in treatment.
Well, you take away their health insurance, and then they won't be able to pay for their insurance.
So you can find this online. It's live streamed from a hearing before the state legislature in Georgia. Betty Price is a medical doctor.
Wife of.
We hate to do this, but she is the wife of what's his name? Price. Thomas Price, right?
Health and Human Services.
Yes.
Health and Human Services.
Yeah, he's just been moved or resigned one step ahead of being moved from the Trump administration cabinet. for his misuse of air. Private jets. Private jets. I'm sorry, so the fact that this discourse 2 weeks ago by a medical doctor in the state legislature, for whatever reason, is being used again, or being tested out again, or being used again and not being challenged in any significant way, made us all in our planning group realize, oh, this is not just a history piece. This is happening here and now again. So maybe we didn't need that, but we just thought we'd get your blood boiling before we started. Raise the temperature in the room. So I'm going to ask each of us in one sentence, I'm going to take a risk, to say in one sentence, before our panelists do their introductions, one sentence, your name and why you came to this workshop, okay? Is that all right? Because we're a small group. This might not go around all the way.
There's plenty of cord.
Is there plenty of cord?
Yeah, one recorder.
And then when we get to the panelists, when it hits them, I'm going to ask them to do their longer first go around, which was your name, your context, your first aid story. All right?
My name is Lynn Gerber. I'm here because I'm writing a history of MCC San Francisco and AIDS, and I'm here in part because I really want history and present and future to be in conversation with each other, and I'm trying to learn how to do that from everyone here.
I'm Nancy Wilson, Metropolitan Community Churches, and this is the 12-step group for people who are survivors around HIV and AIDS, yes. And Jim Metulsky once told me that someday maybe we'd have 15 minutes to process what happened, so I'm here for that.
I'm Bobby Raymer, and I'm a 27-year survivor. I have had zero viral load for well over 20 years. And just here to be part of things, to talk about my past maybe, and to kind of catch up on what's going on. I moved to Ogden, Utah in 2009, so I feel I'm kind of in a backwater.
My name is Aubrey Thonvold, and I came because my hope is that, one, to learn and to listen, to learn through listening, and then just to think about what I can bring forward through my organization for World AIDS Day.
Jeanette Mott Oxford, Empower Missouri is staffing the effort to reform Missouri's HIV-specific criminal codes. So I'm here to be inspired about that current work.
Heather White, I'm here because you all are amazing.
Brian McNaught. When I was the mayor of Boston's liaison to the gay community in 1982, I started the first task force on AIDS in the United States at a city level. And there were only 3 cases in Massachusetts, and people were saying you're overreacting. And we did some pretty amazing work, including write the blood donation code at the time.
I'm Kevin Pilot, a 31-year survivor, and just here to learn and to share.
I'm Micah Hartung, and I came into Metropolitan Community Church in 1984, so I was actually starting to begin ministry right in the AIDS crisis in the Metropolitan Community Church. And I wondered, where were all the Christians that were helping us, that were supposed to help us in this time? And all I knew is at that point, I was Gina and not Micah, and we were the ones that stood up to take care of our brothers and sisters that were dying. And my first hands-on was Daryl Stevens. He was the partner of a district coordinator, Bob Arthur, and he had, the AIDS virus had gone into his head. And so I called him and said, do you want to come to Montana and be in my home? And Irene's an RN, and I'll take care of you. And so he came to my house on the 26th of May, and he had died by June 12th. But I did all the care myself. The church let me have the time off, and they preached the sermons, and I did full care till he crossed over. Met his parents over the phone, and then got the arrangements made for him to be shipped back to Los Angeles, where he didn't want to go because they put his brother in a nursing home. So that was my first hands-on with loving someone as they cross over. And it's been a series of that since.
I'm Dwayne Davis, and I'm here because, when I came of age and was coming out, the cocktail just changed everyone's life. I didn't really have to experience what so many people gone through. But when I became a pastor and really became a pastor to African American gay, bi, MSMs, and the spread of HIV, I just am in this place of frustration and want to know everything that you all did and how you face this challenge, because we have a challenge right now that I'm on the ground for in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and it's very frustrating to see that kind of ignorance, and I see it every day, just in working with people and organizations and government. So I just want to know learn as much, so that we can do that work and make some change the way the earlier generation did.
My name is Justin Tanis, and I'm here because I know I continue to be impacted by the trauma and the grief that I experienced in the 80s and 90s in ministry, and I know that continues to impact me in both positive and difficult ways, and because I still have loved ones who are living with HIV, who I love very much.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex McNeil, and I serve as Executive Director of More Light to Presbyterians, and I think part of my role as a younger person, working with people across decades, is to be a story sharer and collect as many stories and experiences as I can to reflect those back to churches that are trying to figure out how to do welcome people, or trying to figure out how to be their best selves. And I often reflect about how much the experience of AIDS in the 80s has impacted our movement, and I want to do everything I can to keep learning about that. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Lena Landstrom. First, I second everything you just said. As a younger person in the movement, I think it's important to remember the trauma, and also how we can continue to heal the generational trauma that's in our movement, and to keep telling the stories of those who are no longer with us. So that's why I'm here.
Hi, I'm John D'Amelio. AIDS is the most important thing in our history of the last 100 years. And more than twice as many people in the US died of AIDS in the 80s than USers who died fighting in Vietnam in the 60s and early 70s. You can teach the 60s and you always teach about Vietnam. You teach the 80s and it doesn't even appear in books about the Reagan years. It's insane.
I'm Steve Fortner. I was Dignity, MCC, now back Dignity again. Living beyond AIDS and moving past all of that and saying, let's look at the future. We look at AIDS and get stuck in it. We don't look at living beyond that part of AIDS. AIDS holds us. I want to look at further down the road.
So here beginneth our panel.
Here beginneth.
So that means that all right.
You just want to do this right?
So yeah. So I'm going to ask you to change mode slightly. Name, context. As we did in our Zoom conferences, one good AIDS story that epitomizes that era. They don't have to be comprehensive, just representative.
Oh, come on.
I want to be comprehensive. No.
I've got a second.
Yeah.
And probably a third.
I'm Rick Mixon. He, him, his. What to say? I'm the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Palo Alto, California, currently. But for about 10, 12 years, I did AIDS work in Berkeley and San Francisco. I did a PhD in religion and personality, pastoral care and counseling at the GTU. And my dissertation, title of which is Learning the Language of Lament on Suffering and Human Wholeness, deals with how gay and bisexual men responded to the HIV crisis in particular, and what we learned from suffering and the capacity for the necessity of learning how to lament, to cry out, to name our suffering so that we could move on. And the story I want to tell, I hope I can tell this briefly, it's in my dissertation, but it's just a story that came to me and stuck with me. Somewhere in the early, mid-'80s, I was trained in the Shanti program in San Francisco, which was kind of the premier training program for people who are going to do AIDS support work. Kind of a new agey kind of spiritual training, and we this intense weekend of learning how to sit with people at the very deepest level of their pain and their spiritual expression, and just the deepest kind of religious, spiritual living that you can living and dying that you can imagine. And so I was working at the Pacific. I was a volunteer at the Pacific Center in Berkeley, the LGBTQIA mental health and support agency in Berkeley, and I was one of the first group of people trained with Shanti, and I was sent out to see the first AIDS patient from Pacific Center in 1980, whatever it was. And so I went. I got all dressed up and went to Highland Hospital, the county hospital, to see this AIDS patient, and of course, in those days, you masked and you gowned, and he was isolated in a room by himself, and I went in prepared to have this conversation of great depth and meaning, and he didn't want to talk about that stuff at all. He had very practical concerns, a very practical, down-to-earth kind of guy about what was going to happen to his apartment, what was going to happen to his stuff, and it was a huge lesson for me in learning to be with people where they are and not come with my set of assumptions, which I think we often tend to do. And it went into my dissertation in the sense of learning something about accompaniment, being willing to be with people where they are, to walk with people where they need to go. It's part of learning, as Sheldon Sutherland said back in the day, the church has AIDS. And for people who are willing to be open and to learn something about this, it did have a huge impact on those churches that were open to it. And it did help to shape the nature of ministry and helped us redefine what it meant to do ministry in the church. Accompaniment is a huge thing.
It was a very nice. I'm Bill Johnson. Am I supposed to say something else?
A little bit about your context.
Him, his.
Tell a story. Pronouns, context, tell a story.
Oh, yeah, pronoun.
Tell us a story, Bill.
Okay.
That's the most important.
It was July of 1981, and in New York, we opened the New York Times and read about this new disease.
Yeah.
And 42 men in California and New York had been diagnosed with illnesses that were not normally seen. Not long after that, my very good friend and a friend to several people in this room, Reverend Michael Collins, was diagnosed with the strange new disease that had no name. And I became part of his support circle. One day he was in the hospital, I went to see him, and I walked in to his room, and he was lying in his own excrement. There was a food tray out by the door. He was crying and very distraught, and the nurses were not responding to his calls. And that was the day that I became an angry AIDS activist. Up until that time, I, wasn't quite sure how all of this was going to dovetail with all of the LGBT work we were doing in the church. And there was part of me, though, that was sort of happy that this epidemic emerged. Don't overdo that when you hear it. And that at least the AIDS epidemic gave us an opportunity to talk about sex in the church in a way that the LGBT conversation never had really gotten to. Now sex was really in people's, people were thinking a lot more about sex because they were thinking about safe sex and what does that mean. And the church had to start thinking about, if we're going to protect the lives of people or help people protect themselves, we have to teach them more about sex and safe sex and all of that. And eventually I developed a course on safe, safer, and safest sex, which I gave to young people, to teenagers who lapped it up, no pun intended. But the thing about the epidemic from my perspective is, there were not only colleagues and friends, there are relatives of mine who died of HIV. One day, when the first person that I knew died, I wrote his name on a piece of paper, and I began a list, and by the time I left New York in 1990, there were 383 names on that list of friends and neighbors and acquaintances and loved ones that I knew who had died. So the other thing I want to say before I pass the microphone is, and our group has talked about this, I described it yesterday as post-traumatic grief syndrome. I've never gotten over the grief, and I don't know that I ever will get over the grief that I experience in my life, and I suspect that that's a huge part of the ministry that has to be done today with literally hundreds of thousands of people, and I'm not sure we're doing it.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm Bishop Zachary Jones of Unity Fellowship Church Movement. My pronouns are he, his, him, Miss Thing, girl please, and any of the other above. No, not old honey, but girl, have you lost your mind kind of thing. I actually had thought that I could avoid this conversation ever again in my life because I came to this work in 1987 when I buried my lover and common law husband at that time. And but I came to it because I came to the conference as a stand-in for Carl Bean. And when I did finally arrive, Mark had already assigned me to this particular panel, so it doesn't look like we can get away from it, even when we want to, because I am still healing. I asked that question in the earlier session this morning, because to even dream or imagine a world, our lives, without HIV and AIDS must be just that, a dream for some of us. But certainly to touch those who lived pre-AIDS, one can only imagine what that must have been like, even with all of the challenges that they had. I guess I've invited my story in my introduction, and I'll say more as we move forward. Yes.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Satin. I'm with the National LGBTQ Task Force. I do the faith work for the task force. My involvement started way before I came out. I was on the board of the regional blood center for the Red Cross in the Upper Midwest, and was offended and traumatized by the way in which the Red Cross was handling its notification of people who were diagnosed, and basically they had no understanding of the impact that that diagnosis was going to have on people. So they would send letters, or they would make phone calls and just leave a voicemail saying, by the way, you have been diagnosed with HIV. Not realizing that, in many cases, people were living at home with families, or they were with people that they didn't want to know this. So we started an AIDS oversight committee to try and work throughout the Red Cross to try and help them understand the impact that this was going to have. And that was the beginning of my involvement. When I came out, I have had the honor of being on the board of a number of organizations, including serving with Dwayne in Minneapolis with Claire Housing, doing work with the Aliveness Project. And I do a lot of work around aging issues, and I've been struck by the fact that one of the major tragedies is the fact that there are people don't understand the fact that there are many people who are now living with AIDS and living as old people. There's nothing wrong with the word old. Anybody from OLAC will tell you that. I was struck by an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about a person saying, I'm the unluckiest lucky person in the world because I'm living with AIDS, but I didn't expect to. And it's a challenge for them because they've lost support systems, they've lost their financial resources. They just didn't expect to be old. And so that's a current focus of the work that I'm trying to do.
I'm Karen Ziegler, she, hers. I was pastor of MCC New York most of the 80s. And what I feel that we witnessed during that time was really genocide, because people started to die and died at accelerating rates and nothing was being done. And we were just watching with horror. Michael Collins was also a friend of mine, and just, and we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe it. A few years before, I had lived in Philadelphia during the Legionnaires' disease when a few white businessmen died, and it was on the front page every single day. And that contrast did not escape me as hundreds and then thousands of men died and walked through Greenwich Village with their Hickman catheters. But the story that I want to tell is not one of the many, many, many stories of being in dingy Chelsea apartments with friends with uncontrollable diarrhea, or the funerals, or the suffering, or the anger. What I want to tell about was one time when I was with a young man, David DeLuca, who was a cabaret singer, gorgeous man, bright blue eyes, curly dark hair, and he was covered, his face and his entire body covered with Kaposi's. And what I saw in him was what I saw many, many, many times, and it's really my dominant memory of AIDS, which was a luminous quality of his face. He just shone. And my experience was that those young men who weren't afraid of going to hell, and there were a lot of young men afraid of going to hell, whose parents had sent them tracts that said, you are going to hell and you deserve this. But the young men who got through that were not afraid. They were not afraid on the whole. They were amazing people who taught me such profound lessons of what it really means to be a human being. And on that day, he looked at me and he said, I think I volunteered for this. he said, I have the sense that this epidemic and our suffering and our death is going to change human beings and will create compassion. And for that moment, I just believed him because he spoke with such conviction. And just one other little story about him was he called me up and he was in the hospital, and I knew he was very close to death. And I said, how are you? And he said, I'm excited. And I thought I misunderstood him because he was really close to death. And I said, what? And he said, I'm excited. I'm going to see him. And in that moment of that conversation on the phone, the veil completely lifted for me, because it had completely lifted for him. And it was as though we were peering together. And for me, I think the reason why I don't cry very much is because I think that what was happening in those years that he showed me and that other young men showed me, and that I learned about what death is and what human life really is, became the dominant memory for me. And I just want to say one thing about trauma, and I'm so glad that this young woman mentioned trauma, because I've been thinking a lot about intergenerational trauma and about how young gay people are traumatized by us in the same way as children of Holocaust survivors were traumatized by their parents' experiences. And there are people writing about this now. And I've been thinking a lot about post-traumatic slave trauma and the trauma of people of color, and especially black people in this country, in relation to that. And what I realize is that black people in this country did survive so much trauma, but also lived because of that same luminous survivor spiritual strength. And that is our legacy to our young people, as well as the violence and the genocide and the death and the suffering. Can I say one more thing then?
Yeah.
Okay. So I also really want to say that we are revisiting a time of genocide. It is completely clear to me that, and William Barber says, you know, the reason why they want to cut off people's life insurance, health insurance, is because the people who will die as a result of this are not Republican voters. And that is not a cynical statement. That is a statement of historical fact. This is what happened to health plans for people who had been slaves, and they were discontinued when those people started voting. And when people lose their health insurance, they die. So I feel like that spirit of activism that was in ACT UP, and that many of us participated in.
So we want them to hear what we're saying.
That spirit of activism that, I'm sorry. Sorry, I've been told to shut up my whole life.
Yes, we can hear them too.
You're right.
So part of the ecology of sharing space is you hear people in an apartment building. Sorry.
But that spirit of activism in the people with AIDS, the people in ACT UP fighting for their lives, we have to fight for the people's lives who now there's a huge train called genocide heading down the tracks. And we're on the tracks, but so are a whole lot of other people.
So my name is Jim Matulski, and I was the pastor of the MCC church in San Francisco in the 80s and 90s for 15 years. So principally AIDS years. I've done other AIDS things, but that probably has shaped my life more than anything. Sorry. It started back there, and then it just I hate this. So I cry all the time. I know what I do. I just cry all the time, 3 times a day at least. I haven't yet today, so it was this morning's now. Okay. All right. And I didn't before AIDS. So maybe I should have. Yeah. So an AIDS story, I have to say, it's also shaped not only my life, but my spiritual life. This is not what I've had to say, but I do think it has shaped my spiritual life. Being with so many people on a journey of living and dying from the time I was in my 20s, right? Probably when maybe we were too young, or who knows if you're too young or too old, but certainly this affect you. I think twisted me in some ways. I was not prepared in my 20s to accompany so many people, to do hundreds of funerals, which I literally did do. Saturday was funeral day, Sunday was church day, right? And the people that I was doing funerals for in the 80s were my age. How weird is that? And also it kicked up a need in me for constant prayer. I went to a very liberal seminary, as we say, Pacific School of Religion, and what characterized us as MCC students was we were churchgoers, unlike our fellow students. That we went to church. How weird is that? In the 80s, that was weird. And I go to Mass every day. How weird is that? I'm not a Catholic anymore. Or maybe once a Catholic, always a Catholic. Yeah. Because, and what I do, I go and I sit in the back, I don't take communion. I cry. I sit there and I cry. Because it's how I find peace. And I order my day. And I feel close to my saints. And I don't mean like the alabaster ones. And I know that comes from my AIDS experience. It's the only way I find peace in it. And I pray the rosary. Now and at the hour of our death, that little phrase that you learn as a child was like a seed planted that came back to comfort me, being at the death of so many people, and not lose your mind, right? Okay, so here's one AIDS story. It's a funeral story I've told before. But you do all these funerals, and what I love about MCC is we do not have a prayer book. We had the freedom to show Al Parker clips at Al Parker's funeral. I did Al Parker's funeral, and darn if we didn't show Al Parker clips at it, because he wanted to be remembered in his vigor. And I did not learn how to do that funeral at PSR, I'll tell you that. But the funeral I remember, I did this couple's wedding, because we did a lot of deathbed weddings, right? Before they were legal. And it wasn't quite deathbed, but the first guy had lived about 3 weeks. And at his funeral, the first guy's funeral, everyone got an orchid. And because he wanted people to have something lovely when they left, something beautiful, because it was not pretty. And at the door, his lover, as we were greeting people at the door afterwards, his lover said, "Orchids, just like him, high maintenance, hot house." And I just burst out laughing, and I remember, and it was affectionate, but it was funny. I mean, it's pretty funny. At your lover's funeral. And I remember the importance of laughter, even in the midst of very deep sadness. And a couple of months later, we had his funeral. And he had provided for this, and he swore me to secrecy. His lifelong collection of Fiesta ware in the sanctuary. And, only gay men have the cult of Fiesta ware. They don't just like it. Okay, they worship it, and it was all there. And at gay funerals, we had stuff. The leather jacket on a chair, the memorabilia, all kinds of memorabilia, right? but the fiesta, so the queens came in and they were like, maybe I'll get some afterwards, because that was what they thought. And of course, they had missed their friend, but yeah, it's nice to get a little bonus at the memorial. And at the end, he had instructed me to do this. I picked up a piece, so this is, how much he loved this, and I broke it. The gasp. No, not the fiesta ware. And then I broke another piece, and I said, let's all do this, because Jerry Robinson was his name. He said he wanted us to get angry. He wanted us to feel our anger. Nothing pretty, like we did, I can't remember his lover's name, at his lover's funeral. But he wanted us to get angry and feel our anger. And so there we were, breaking dishes in the funeral, in the sanctuary. And that anger, also, I felt it again this morning when Chuck Lewis talked about smashing the light bulbs. Oh, I just felt so alive. Did you feel it for a second? So unassuming to the anger. And I thought, oh, this is why we did this panel, so that we could see that and feel it. And that's kind of, when you asked Dwayne about, how do you do this? Anger is an important part of it. Find your anger. I know it's probably dysfunctional, but I swear to God that is how I got through it. That and, protease. But I think my anger has kept me alive as much as medical science, So, Brian. But you have to use this.
I was trained as a buddy. I think probably a lot of us in this room were trained as hospice workers as best could be done. And the one of the men that I took under wing and brought to my home and spent time with asked, without me knowing it, asked his parents if I would be the one who led his funeral. So there are, and it was not unusual for people who were not clergy to be asked to be the person who spoke for them. And for those of you who don't know the time, what happened at the time, his parents said to me, please do not say that he was gay or how he died. My first buddy that we buried, we had the same instructions. Do not say that he was gay, and do not say how he died. And one can get self-righteous in those situations and defy the will of the parents. Or you can figure out a way to do what needs to be done without anybody getting upset. So the second guy that I spoke for was a florist. And his gay friends were in the back of the room, and his great aunts were in the front of the room. And I talked about his uniqueness as a flower, and how in bouquets, we all come in different shapes and colors and sizes, and the gay men were nodding their head in the back of the room, and the aunts were thinking that this was quite colorful talk. How sweet. But it wasn't a time in which, in San Francisco, was different than Boston. New York was different than Boston. And Boston was different than Cleveland. And you did what you could do and needed to do where you were with the needs of the people that you said you were there to help. Right? So, I didn't get angry. It's not my style. It's just never been. That I do go underwater and scream. That's my scream room, water. But going to the question that the man in the back asked about how do you handle the situation, we didn't have ACT UP in Boston because we kept the community informed from day one. I wrote a weekly column, started a column to the gay community in Boston, telling them what we knew. You know, what was the name? Why was it called this? You know, what do we think is going on? So that people didn't live in a vacuum of no information. And so the dynamics of a community, I think, create how you respond. But it's important to know that at that time, you just didn't talk about it without knowing or feeling that the needs of the parents and the needs of the family had to be taken into consideration.